The Korringe. Written by Ron Mackenzie Lafergie. Narrated by the same person. This is the story of a man named Henry. Henry lived in a house, on a street, in a town, in a province, in a country. And that country was called Canada. And that province was called Ontario. And that town was called Grimsby. And that street was called Clanter Street. And that house didn't have a name because people don't name their houses. But Henry had a name, and it was Henry. Henry was unemployed. He had been for some time, ever since the accident. Well, it wasn't so much an accident as it was a mistake. A big mistake. Involving ketchup. It's a long story, but briefly, Henry was at work in his office where he filled out papers and typed up forms and signed stuff and decided to get a burger. So he went downstairs and across the street to the burger store. This was his usual haunt. He went there 2 or 3 times a week, and while his doctor did not approve, his tongue did. He walked in the door and was greeted by his second favorite worker there. "Hey, Hank!" called Freddie. He was the only person who called Henry Hank, and Henry didn't like it. That's why Freddie was his second favorite. "Hey, Freddie," said Henry. Unbeknownst to him, he was the only person who called Fred Freddie, but Fred, not being a grumpy pants, found it endearing. "The usual?" asked Fred. "Yep," said Henry. He never thought he'd be the kind of person who had a usual. Normally, he would try lots of different things. He always figured having a usual meant you had plateaued and your life was boring. But here he was, ordering the same double cheeseburger with lettuce, tomato, and guacamole he always got. Oh, how things change. He stood there silently as the food was prepared. The first few times he'd come in, the workers had tried to get into small talk with him, but they quickly learned that he was neither interested in nor capable of small talk. So now, silence reigned. Soon he had his burger and was heading out the door. As he left, however, another customer accosted him. "Hey, you didn't put ketchup on that, did you?" No. Why?" asked Henry, perplexed. "Good. Don't put ketchup on your burger." "Why not?" "It ruins a burger." "No, it doesn't." Henry realized by now that this argument was a stupid one, but the other guy was clearly wrong and belligerent, so he was committed now. "Yes, it does." "No, it doesn't, and I'll prove it." Henry took his burger out of the bag, opened up the foil, and opened up the burger. "Freddie, can I have some ketchup, please?" "Sure thing, Hank," said Fred cautiously. Henry was too incensed with the jerk in the fancy suit to even notice the name this time. He took the bottle of ketchup from Fred and started pouring. He poured more ketchup than he'd ever poured before, more ketchup, perhaps, than anyone had ever used before. Frankly, it disgusted him a bit, but the look on Suit Guy's face told him it disgusted him far more. And Henry was pleased. Then he put the burger back together, looked the man dead in the eyes, and took a big, squishy bite. To his surprise, the man made to smack the burger out of his hands, but Henry managed to pull it away. When Fred saw that, he asked the man to leave and gave Henry a sharp look that said, "Stop antagonizing my customers." As this was happening, Henry could feel himself dissociating. This happened from time to time when he got into an argument, though that was usually online, not in person. But he recognized the feeling and knew he was about to do something stupid. He also knew that there was nothing he could do to stop himself. Just as the man opened the door, Henry made his grievous error. "Hey, buddy!" he called as his eyes clouded over with red. The man turned and was hit in the face with a ketchup grenade. "Dude!" cried Fred. "What are you doing? Get out of here! You're not starting a food fight in my restaurant!" Henry wanted to point out that it was not Freddy's restaurant, that he just worked there, but the cloud of red was fading, and he was starting to realize that he was being a giant dork. So, tail between his legs, he scooped up his now completely inedible burger and left. Boobada-boobada-boobada. Lance put down his pen. He had written himself into a bit of a corner. Why'd he started with such a specific description? If he just said the bit about the ketchup, he could have written a pretty good interaction. Instead, he'd left in that whole accident but not really thing, which made the rest of the story become lame. He had found a way to make it work and was going to make the annoying customers some higher up at Henry's company, but it just didn't feel right. Lance decided to cut his losses and try again later. Lance hadn't been writing for very long, less than a year, really, and he was starting to wonder if he should be doing more outlining. He'd made detailed outlines when he'd first started. However, he found that by the time he finished the outline, he was bored of the story and never really finished it. Now he kind of just made it up as he went along. This was fun and kept it fresh, and it was really satisfying to find that last piece of the narrative puzzle which really brought the story together. Sometimes, however, he never found that missing puzzle piece, and the story was left in fiction limbo. Lance worried that he should have just stayed in law school, that his dream of being a writer was foolish. He'd been doing pretty well in his first year, after all, A's and B's, which is more than most people can say. He just hated it. He hated it so much. He'd gone to law school to get started with real life, but he found that the more he tried to force real life, the faker it felt. He was a pretender, a cosplayer, playing make-believe as an adult. This concept bled into his personal life, too. Lance had gotten married recently to his beautiful wife Giselle, whom he lovingly called Giz, and as happy as he was, he couldn't help feeling like he was playing house. Though he was 30 years old, he still felt like an 8-year-old, looking around at an uncertain world and doing his best to look like he knew what he was doing. Nearly a month after the wedding, it still felt wrong to refer to his wife. Hell, he'd barely even gotten the hang of fiancé, despite the 3-year engagement. Lance stood from his desk and grabbed the leash. His dog, Anouk, sprang off the couch and rushed to the front door. "You want to go for a walk?" asked Lance, relishing in the dog's excitement at those words. Maybe a nice stroll around the block would clear his head. As they started walking, Lance breathed in the fresh summer air. He didn't really like summer. It was fine, better than winter, but he didn't do well in the heat. It made him sweat a bunch, which made him stink. Plus, he'd been having these weird issues in his butt crack where it would get all irritated if he got too sweaty, so he had to start walking all funny, which was super embarrassing, not to mention painful. They walked, and his dog sniffed every damn tree she saw. Lance tried to hurry her along, but he didn't have the heart most of the time. It felt so mean to pull her away from sniffing, which seemed to be her favorite thing to do, aside from eating rabbit turds. Lance could feel himself getting bored, which was good because boredom tended to precede good ideas on his walks. At home, he had a habit of watching videos on his iPad all day, much to Jiz's chagrin, to distract himself from the annoying thoughts like, I hate myself, and what would happen if I just killed myself? To be clear, he didn't actually want to kill himself, it's just a thought that occurred from time to time. Existence may be hard at times, but as far as Lance was concerned, it beat the alternative. Plus, who knows, maybe if you die, you wake up in a torture world. Better to play it safe in this one. Where was I? Right, the walk. The nice thing about the walk is it forced Lance to be in his head, where thoughts whizzed around at 1,000,000 miles a minute. This was stressful, but it yielded some good ideas. It also yielded some terrible ideas, but them's the breaks. Suddenly, a spaceship landed in the park next to him. Bibida-bibida. James chuckled and put down his pen. That last line was a joke, of course. He had a habit of getting bored with a story and just throwing in aliens. It seldom worked. He was getting annoyed with his story. The tale within a tale was okay, but then he just started rambling about stuff nobody cared about in an attempt to seem relatable. The problem is, he was a weird guy, so a lot of the things he thought were relatable weren't relatable to other people. But that's hard to gauge because it's super relatable to him since he's the one who wrote it. He also wasn't sure the suicide thing was a good idea. Would it come off as a cry for help? Would people think this was his way of saying he actually did want to kill himself? How could he stress that this was just fiction without making it seem like he doth protest too much? Gah, it all felt so masturbatory. Chances are most other people would think it was just a boring slice of life from a boring loser. A boring loser, by the way, with butt problems. Did he really want to keep that in? People would just start wondering if he was speaking from experience. Then those who thought he was speaking from experience would be grossed out. Was it worth it for the cheap laugh and not-so-subtle confessional? James stood up and switched his desk to its standing position. He'd been sitting on his poor hiney for long enough, and it needed a break. He picked up his pen, crossed out the bit about the alien, and started writing again. There was an interesting thing about books, dear reader. Try as I might to convey my story to you, the image in my head will never reach you in one piece. Take the park Lance was walking past, for instance. I'm picturing the park near my house. But you may be picturing one near your house, or one where you spent a lot of time as a kid, or maybe one you were at recently. Maybe in your mind, Lance was walking through your neighborhood. I was picturing the suburbs, but maybe you live in the city. What kind of dog does he have? I never mentioned. I'm picturing my own dog, whose name is actually a Nook. She's a husky mix. But I bet you weren't picturing that. What were you picturing? Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da. Again, James put down his pen. Did he want to go so meta? He really liked the idea of the third-person narrator being more open and talking from a perspective of their own, but he was worried that people would find it annoying. A lot of the time, something James found neat or interesting just came off as lame to other people. But he told himself that he would just keep writing for himself and hope that he could find an audience that liked the same things. James. He looked around, startled, but saw nothing. James. The voice was louder this time and echoed throughout the room. Who are you? He asked, voice instantly shaking. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da. Rebecca stopped typing and put her head in her hands. Who was it? She wasn't so sure herself. Was it just a random ghost that would send James on some big adventure? Was it a mental creation of his, a personification of his self-doubt? Would people judge her for talking so much about self-doubt when that was already such a well-trodden subject for writers? She didn't know. This whole story had gotten away from her. It had started out as an exercise to learn to write male characters, something she believed she had failed at, but now she was just writing for the sake of writing. It had become such a jumble of stories within stories that she wanted to stop and start over, but she'd already written so much that the sunk cost would eat at her. Speaking of eating, she reached over and plucked a piece of apple from her bowl, biting into it with a satisfying crunch. She had recently begun sprinkling her apple slices with lemon juice, and it had done wonders. No longer did they turn brown within minutes. Now she could munch away at her own pace. Plus, the lemon gave him a nice zing. You're welcome, dear reader, for the tip. Rebecca wondered if she should go back a few layers and return to Henry. Maybe she could find a way to turn that hamburger story into something interesting. Instinctually, her brain said, yeah, maybe he gets abducted by aliens. But then she caught herself and put an end to that train of thought. No more aliens. Not for a while, at least. With a sigh, she returned to her story. Who are you? He asked, voice instantly shaking. I'm the ghost of Judy Garland, replied the voice. Rebecca deleted that. I'm your great-great-grandfather, and I... Nope, no good. Delete. I'm your imaginary friend, and I'm here to help you with your writing. Hey, that might work. My imaginary friend? I don't have an imaginary friend. Nobody does, silly. We're imaginary. James paused and thought that one over. It didn't quite make sense, but he just went with it. Why can't I see you? There was a pause. Again, because I'm imaginary. Who knew imaginary friends could be so sassy? Right, but, I can hear you, so why can't I see you? Don't ask me. I'm just a figment of your imagination. So if I imagine you looking a certain way, you'll appear that way? One way to find out. suddenly Jennifer Aniston appeared on his bed. But like season 2 of Friends, Jennifer Aniston. Also, she was dressed like a sexy schoolgirl. It was hot. Bibbidi-bibbidi. Ugh! Cried Rebecca as she pushed her keyboard away forcefully. Writing dudes was hard. All they thought about was sex, but when you write about them thinking about sex, it sounds like women writing men, even though that's definitely what a guy would do. It was time for a break. Rebecca closed her laptop and turned on the kettle to make some tea. She opened up the tea cupboard, surveying her choices. Irish breakfast? English breakfast? Maybe channel her inner Jean-Luc Picard and go with Earl Grey? Yeah, that's the one. That way she could feel all clever and confident like Picard, and maybe channel that into a positive, realistic male character. And hey, maybe for a bit of extra inspiration, she'd watch an episode of The Next Generation. That would get the juices flowing. So she turned on Season 1, Episode 1, intent on a rewatch, ready to watch Wesley be a little dork for an hour. However, as you may know, TNG starts with a 2-part episode. So, not wanting to be a heretic, Rebecca watched the second episode. But then she thought, those episodes don't really count because they don't feel like Trek. So she watched a third episode. By then, it was about supper time, so she went to the fridge and heated up some pizza from the night before. And, of course, it's hard to write while eating, so she sat down for another episode of Trek. And then another. And another. And then it was bedtime. Oops. Rebecca didn't feel particularly tired, but she knew she had to be up at a decent time the next day for work, so she tried to sleep. She failed. She'd never been very good at sleeping. Her mind was never unoccupied, so when there wasn't a show or podcast taking up her attention, she found herself mentally hopping from thought to thought, even though that thought was often, I need to stop thinking and sleep. Eventually, however, she fell asleep. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da. All right, that's enough of that, I muttered, putting my computer to sleep and stepping away. I wasn't sure if I'd do a dream sequence or just transition to the next day. I wanted to think about that before committing time into it. There was nothing more frustrating than realizing you'd have to throw out a big chunk of writing. I mean, that's not true. There's a lot that's more frustrating than that, but you know what I mean. It's an expression. I'm just saying it's frustrating. Frankly, if this was a book, I'd probably cut out this paragraph because it's pretty pointless. But this is not a book. This is real life. I think. I'd been thinking about simulation theory a lot recently, so from time to time I found myself wondering if this was, in fact, real life. Sometimes I think about my propensity to think up weird ideas and stories, and wonder if I was just some AI created to think of a bunch of ideas so some author could take them and make books and movies from them. That would be kinda cool, actually. It'd sure beat fruitlessly pounding away at a keyboard, writing short stories that nobody even reads or listens to. But, alas, as far as I could tell, this was real life. And it wasn't so bad. I had a good family and a good wife. Sorry, great wife. Wouldn't want her to get the wrong idea. Although she doesn't really read my stuff anyway, not that I could blame her, so there isn't much danger. Good thing I don't get my self-worth from the appraisal of others, huh? Yeah, good thing. I sprawled out on the couch, iPad in hand, and started browsing Reddit. This is something I did way too much. I tried to convince myself that I was spending time usefully, becoming more knowledgeable about politics and whatnot, but I knew that if I spent half my Reddit time on writing, I'd have about a dozen novels written by now. I probably have ADHD. I went on a bit of a YouTube binge on it a while back, and it felt like a glove. I think the only reason I wasn't diagnosed is that I was great at school, because, as I implied before, I get an unhealthy amount of my self-worth from the approval of others, especially adults. That is to say, older adults, seeing as I was 30 years old and was technically an adult myself. But I wasn't an adult. It feels so weird calling people my age men and women. No, men and women are older than me. Men my age are lads or guys. Women my age are lasses or chicks, or, when I'm feeling snazzy, gals. Intellectually, I'm aware that this is dumb, but in my heart, I can't seem to accept that I'm no longer a teenager. I had a weird moment the other day involving this. I saw someone complaining about young people nowadays, and I got defensive. I'm not like that, I thought. How dare they generalize like that? Then I realized that they were talking about people over a decade younger than me, and suddenly I agreed with them. Screw those dumb kids. Go eat a Tide Pod, you loser. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da. Sai stopped writing and stared at his computer screen. That was probably a bit too aggressive. Maybe he'd tone down the hate just a smidge. Although the Tide Pod thing was admittedly really dumb. Friggin' kids. He also wasn't sure how he felt about the sudden switch to first person. His hope was that the switch would make people think that was actually real life, so that when he zoomed out again, they'd be all, "Whoa, I didn't see that coming." But he was pretty sure most people would still be expecting another zoom out. Whatever. It wasn't his best work anyway. It was turning into a very thinly veiled confessional, which isn't remotely where he wanted to go in the beginning. Really, all he wanted in the beginning was to keep zooming out. That was the gag. That you'd start thinking the story was picking up, then bam, turns out it was a story in a story. There was probably a name for this kind of thing, but Sai didn't know it. He knew people tried to use inception or just blankception to describe stuff like this, but it doesn't really work, especially since inception had another definition entirely in the movie itself. Sai paused. Maybe this was his chance. Maybe, like Shakespeare, he could think up a word to describe this phenomenon, and that would make all the nonsense worth it. Not only would it finally bring the stupid short story to a close, but it could rocket him to stardom as the term became used by writers everywhere. But what would the word be? He wanted it to sound different from other words. It should stand out as a new kind of word, so that people would hear it and go, "What the heck is that?" Then they'd look it up, they'd see that he'd invented it, then they'd read all his short stories and see that he was the best writer who ever existed. Or something, just spitballing. How about Korringe? So I was pretty sure that wasn't a word. And it sounded weird, like it came from another language or something. Yep, Korringe was the way to go. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da. Ken stopped. This was terrible. Truly terrible. But it had served its purpose. He may not write as well as Shakespeare, but he could invent a word too. He returned to the poem he was working on, added the final line, then read it aloud to himself. It's tricky to analogize my care for you, my dove. Juxtaposed beside another, they can't match my love. For you compared to anyone are an apple to an orange, and when I share my love for you, it's layered, like a Korringe. He sighed and crumpled out the piece of paper. All that work to invent a word and the poem wasn't even good. Back to the drawing board.